The clock ticked loudly, each second cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. The air felt thick, choking, as fear gripped the classroom. The once bright walls, painted with cheerful sunflowers and rainbows, were now lost in darkness. In the storage closet, children huddled together, their small bodies trembling like leaves in a storm. No one dared to speak. Even the youngest, who never sat still, froze in fear. The bookshelf, meant to guard the magic of stories, was now wedged against the door, a feeble barrier against the unknown terror outside. The sounds in the hallway were growing louder. A door slammed. Someone cried out. Then came the sharp, jarring crack of a gunshot, shattering the silence into shards of panic. Screams erupted, desperate and raw, from somewhere beyond the room. Inside the closet, the children held their breath as heavy footsteps approached. The weight of each step was a cruel countdown. Thud. 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 The doorknob rattled violently. Then a thunderous crash. The door flung open, and there he stood, a man cloaked in darkness, his face twisted in anger that burned hotter than fire. He raised the rifle. The teacher screamed, throwing herself forward in a futile attempt to shield the children. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, silencing her instantly. Her lifeless body hit the ground with a thud. The children stared in wide-eyed horror, paralyzed as he stepped closer. Their world, once full of innocent laughter and hope, now reeked of blood and smoke. And then, one by one, the shots rang out. When the police sirens wailed in the distance, the man fled, leaving behind a room soaked in tragedy. Outside, chaos had erupted. Parents wailed as stretchers carried lifeless bodies. News cameras swarmed, capturing every detail of the horror. But in the midst of the chaos, one thought lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Why?
You think monsters are born? No, we're not. We are made. Slowly, piece by piece. You judge me, you'll hate me, but maybe, when you hear this, you'll understand. Or maybe you won't. Either way, this is my story. My name is Bantu. Once, I was like those children, innocent, full of dreams, hoping to escape the shadows of poverty. Now, I'm sitting here, bound by chains, staring into the cold eyes of the man recording my confession. He's silent, but his expression says it all: disgust, pity, anger. I don't care. I take a deep breath. My voice shakes at first, but I force myself to speak. It started with the shoes. I was 7 when I first stepped into that school. Mama walked with me that day, holding my hand tightly. I remember the pride in her voice as she whispered, "My Bantu will become somebody. You change everything for us." The school wasn't much. Cracked walls, broken desks, and a roof that leaked whenever it rained. But to me, it was a palace. I'd stare at the chalkboard, imagining the life that education would bring me, a life far from the dusty streets of our township. For the first few years, I loved school. I didn't care that my uniform was second-hand, that my shoes had holes in them, or that I carried my books in a plastic bag. I had dreams. I believed that if I worked hard, I could rise above it all. But dreams don't last long when reality keeps pulling you down. I'll never forget the day it began. It was the day of an exam. Mr. Nlovu, the head teacher, was standing at the front of the classroom. He was a big man, with a voice that could shake the walls. He looked down at me with eyes that saw nothing but my poverty. "Bantu," he said, his voice sharp, "wear your proper shoes. You think you can come to school like this?" I looked down at my feet. My shoes, if you could even call them that, were barely holding together. They'd been passed down from my older brother, their so thin you could feel every stone on the road. "Go home," Mr. Nlovu said. "You're not fit to be here." I begged. I pleaded. Please, sir, I studied all night. I'm ready for the exam. Please. But he didn't care. In front of the whole class, he dragged me out. The other children laughed as I stumbled, my face burning with shame. I walked home barefoot that day. The stones cut into my skin, but the pain in my chest was worse. After that, everything changed. The kids teased me relentlessly. Barefoot Bantu, they called me. They'd point and laugh, their voices echoing in my head even when I was alone. I tried to ignore them, but their words stuck like thorns. Even the teachers treated me differently. They looked at me like I didn't belong, as if my poverty was a stain they couldn't wash away. Mama tried to help. She patched up my shoes, worked extra hours to buy me new ones. But it was never enough. The damage was done. Every time I walked into that school, I felt smaller, weaker, invisible. One day, during break time, I sat under the big mango tree behind the school. It was my only refuge. I stared at the other kids, their laughter echoing like a cruel reminder of everything I wasn't. That was when I first felt it, that cold, bitter anger deep in my chest. It wasn't loud or fiery. It was quiet, like a whisper, but it stayed with me. I clenched my fist, my nails digging into my palms. One day, I thought, they'll see me. They'll all see me. Mama was my anchor. She was always there, no matter how bad things got. Every night, after she returned from her long day washing clothes for rich families, she would sit with me at the small wooden table in our kitchen. The table was old, its legs wobbly, but it was ours. She'd ask about my day. At first, I lied. It was fine, Mama, I'd say, forcing a smile. I didn't want her to worry. But one night, after Mr. Nlovu humiliated me for being late to class because I couldn't afford the bus fare, I broke down. I told her everything, the teasing, the punishments, the shame I felt every time I stepped into that school. She listened quietly, her hands trembling as they rested on her lap. When I finished, she pulled me close and whispered, "You're stronger than this, Bantu. Don't let them break you. One day, they'll see your worth. You show them all." Her words gave me hope, but it was a fragile kind of hope, the kind that cracks under pressure. The teasing at school got worse. It wasn't just about my shoes anymore. It was about everything, the way I spoke, the way I carried myself, the way my stomach growled during lunch because I didn't have anything to eat. There was a boy, Kofi, who seemed to enjoy making my life miserable. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, always dressed in spotless uniforms and shiny shoes. Every day, he found new ways to humiliate me. One afternoon, during sports day, he tripped me on purpose while I was running in a race. I fell hard, scraping my knees on the rough dirt track. The crowd laughed as I struggled to get up. Kofi stood over me, smirking. "You don't belong here, Bantu," he said. "Go back to the gutter where you came from." Those words stayed with me. No matter how much I tried to ignore them, they echoed in my mind, feeding the anger that was growing inside me. At home, things weren't much better. Mama was trying her best, but the weight of everything was taking its toll on her. One night, I found her crying in the kitchen. She didn't notice me at first, but when she looked up and saw me standing there, she quickly wiped her tears away. "It's nothing, Bantu," she said, forcing a smile. But I knew better. The bills were piling up. The landlord had been coming around more often, banging on the door and shouting about overdue rent. Mama's health was worsening, too. The constant work, the stress, it was breaking her. I wanted to help, but I was just a boy. What could I do? One day, something inside me snapped. It was a Friday, and the school was buzzing with excitement. A big event was happening, a cultural day celebration. But for kids like me, who couldn't afford the traditional attire or the fees for the event, it was just another reminder of what we didn't have. During the festivities, I sat alone under the mango tree, watching the others laugh and dance in their colorful outfits. Mr. Nlovu spotted me and walked over. Why aren't you participating, Bantu? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. I didn't answer. Of course, he said, shaking his head. Always the odd one out. Maybe if you spent less time sulking and more time working, you wouldn't be such a disappointment. That was it. The final straw. I stood up, my fist clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hit him, to make him feel the pain he'd caused me. But I didn't. Instead, I walked away, my vision blurred with tears. That night, as I lay on my tin mattress, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. One day, they'll feel what I feel. They'll understand what it's like to be nothing. The days that followed were a blur. I stopped trying in school. What was the point? No matter how hard I worked, I'd always be the boy with the broken shoes, the empty lunchbox, the invisible one. I started skipping classes, wandering the streets instead. I'd sit by the river, throwing stones into the water and watching the ripples spread. It was the only place where I felt at peace, where the weight of the world didn't crush me. But even there, the anger followed me. It whispered in my ear, reminding me of every insult, every humiliation, every moment I was made to feel small. There was one person who tried to reach me. Her name was Zola, a classmate who never joined in the teasing. She was quiet, kind, and always carried a book with her. One day, she found me by the river. You shouldn't skip school, Bantu, she said, sitting down beside me. I didn't reply. I know it's hard, she continued. But you're smart. Smarter than all of them. Don't let them win. For a moment, her words warmed the coldness inside me. But it wasn't enough. The darkness had already taken root. The whispers of anger turned into roars in my head. By the time I was 13, the hope Mama had once poured into me felt like a distant memory. I had started skipping school more often, not because I wanted to but because it was easier to disappear than to endure the constant humiliation. At home, things were no better. The landlord finally gave us a written eviction notice. I remember how Mama held that piece of paper, her hands trembling as if it weighed 100 kilograms. Where will we go? She whispered to herself, thinking I couldn't hear. That night, I watched her stitch clothes under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. She walked into the early hours of the morning, her back hunched and her hands raw. I felt useless. My fist clenched as I sat in the corner, staring at her. Why does the world do this to people like us? The anger grew sharper, the edges cutting into me from the inside. If there was one thing that kept me tethered, it was Zola. She was the only one who saw me, not as a poor boy or a failure, but as a person. She'd find me by the river almost every week, her book always in her hand. Do you know why I like books? She asked one day, her eyes sparkling. I shrugged. Because they remind me that the world doesn't have to stay the way it is. You can write something new, Bantu. You can change your story. Her words hit me harder than I let on. For a brief moment, they made me believe that maybe, just maybe, my life could be different. But life has a cruel way of taking away the things that make it bearable. One day, Zola didn't show up by the river. I waited for hours, staring at the water, thinking she'd come running down the hill with her usual smile. She didn't. The next morning at school, I overheard some of the boys talking. Zola's father took her to live in the city, one of them said, laughing. Guess she's too good for this place now. She was gone. The one person who made the world feel less heavy had left without a word. That day, I stopped going to the river. Without Zola, the days blurred together. The teasing became unbearable. The teachers ignored me completely, as if I didn't exist. At home, the cracks in Momo's health grew worse. She coughed constantly, her thin frame trembling with every breath. One day, I came home to find her lying on the floor. Panic gripped me as I rushed to her side. Mama, wake up. I shouted, shaking her. She opened her eyes weakly and gave me a tired smile. I'm fine, Bantu. Just tired. But she wasn't fine. The doctor at the clinic said it was exhaustion, compounded by malnutrition and stress. He handed me a prescription, the list of medicines long and expensive. I stared at the paper in my hand, my vision blurring with tears. How could I afford this? How could I save her when I couldn't even save myself? The breaking point came one fateful morning. It was during an assembly at school. Mr. Nlovu, as always, was standing at the front, barking orders at the students. I stood in the back, as invisible as ever, when he called my name. Bantu. Come here. Reluctantly, I walked to the front, my heart pounding. He held up a tattered notebook, mine. It was all I had left, the only thing that still connected me to the idea of education. This is a disgrace, he said, flipping through its worn pages. No proper notes, no effort. This is why you'll never be anything in life. The laughter from the students felt like knives slicing through me. I clenched my fist, trying to hold back the tears. But Mr. Nlovu wasn't done. And look at you, he said, gesturing to my uniform, which was patched in so many places it barely held together. You're a joke, Bantu. A waste of space. The word stopped. I don't remember what happened next, but when I came to, I was standing outside the school gates, my fist bloody from punching the brick wall. That night, I sat in the dark corner of our home, staring at my bruised hands. The anger inside me had grown into something monstrous, something that no longer whispered but screamed. I thought about everything, Mr. Nlovu, the teasing, the laughter, Momo's fragile body, Zola's absence. It was like a storm that wouldn't stop raging. I made a promise to myself then. One day, they'll feel what I feel. One day, they'll know what it's like to be invisible, to be nothing. From that day forward, I withdrew completely. I stopped speaking, stopped caring. I became a shadow, moving through the world unnoticed. But in my silence, I was preparing. The anger inside me was no longer wired, it was controlled, focused. I didn't know exactly how I would make them pay, but I knew I would. And that was the beginning of the end. I became a ghost. The teachers no longer called on me, the students no longer mocked me, not because they had stopped, but because I had become invisible. I sat at the back of the classroom, barely listening, my tattered notebook untouched. The whispers around me blurred together, like static in my ears. I was there, but not really. During lunch breaks, I would wander to the edge of the schoolyard, avoiding the mango tree where I once found refuge. Instead, I would stand by the fence, staring out at the dusty road beyond. I wondered what life was like on the other side of that road, away from the mocking laughter and the relentless weight of shame. But even then, the anger followed me. It was no longer chaotic or wild, it was cold, precise, waiting. One day, during a math lesson, Mr. Nlovu decided to remind me of my place. Bantu, he barked, his voice cutting through the monotony of the class. I didn't respond. Stand up, he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Reluctantly, I stood, feeling every pair of eyes turned toward me. Read the answer to problem 5, he demanded, pointing at the chalkboard. I hadn't even opened my notebook. I stared at the board, the numbers swimming in front of me. I don't know, I muttered, my voice barely audible. Mr. Nlovu slammed his ruler against the desk. Speak up. I don't know, I said louder, my chest tightening. The class erupted in laughter. Mr. Nlovu shook his head, his expression a mix of disappointment and disdain. You don't know because you don't try, Bantu. You sit there like a useless lump, wasting everyone's time. Why are you even here? I sat down, my face burning, my fist clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. The laughter echoed in my head long after the bell rang. That evening, Mama came home with a small bundle wrapped in old newspaper. Bantu, she said, her voice soft but tired, come here. I walked to her as she unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a pair of shoes, not new, but sturdy and whole. I saved for months, she said, placing them in my hands. Now you can walk to school without shame. I looked at her, my throat tightening. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her hands raw and cracked from hours of washing clothes. "Thank you, Mama," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "One day, Bantu, you'll make all of this worth it. I know you will." Her faith in me should have been enough to spark hope, but instead, it felt like a weight, a reminder of everything I was failing to do. The new shoes didn't change anything. The teasing continued, the laughter sharper than ever. "Look at barefoot Bantu now," Kofi sneered one morning. "Got yourself some shoes, but you're still nothing." The other boys laughed, their voices like daggers. I clenched my fist, willing myself not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. I started skipping school more often, wandering further from home. The river became my sanctuary again, but even there, the anger found me. I would throw rocks into the water, each splash echoing the frustration in my chest. One day, as I sat by the river, I picked up a sharp stone and clenched it in my hand. The jagged edges bit into my skin, and I watched as a trickle of blood ran down my palm. The pain felt like clarity, a focus amidst the chaos. At home, Momo's health continued to decline. Her coughing fits became more frequent, her body thinner and weaker. The landlord came again, banging on the door, shouting about overdue rent. Momo tried to reason with him, her voice shaking. "Please, just a little more time." The landlord scoffed. "Time won't pay the bills, woman. You have 2 weeks." I stood in the corner, my fist clenched, watching the scene unfold. Every part of me wanted to lash out, to scream, to fight, but I stayed silent. After he left, Mama sank onto the floor, her head in her hands. "It'll be okay, Mama," I said, though I didn't believe it. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "You're all I have, Bantu. Don't give up on yourself." That night, I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The world around me felt like it was crumbling, but inside, the anger burned brighter than ever. I thought about everything, Mama, the teasing, the humiliation, the weight of poverty. One day, I whispered to the shadows, "They'll see me. They'll all see me." It wasn't a wish. It was a promise. A week after the landlord's visit, Momo's cough worsened. She could barely speak, her voice reduced to a raspy whisper. I stayed by her side that night, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. She opened her eyes, weak but determined. "Bantu," she said softly, promise me you'll rise above all this." Her words felt like chains, binding me to an expectation I didn't think I could fulfill. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The next morning, I decided to face the landlord myself. I waited by the road leading to his house, clutching a small basket of fruits Mama had saved. When he appeared, I stepped forward, my voice trembling but firm. "Please, sir, give us more time. My mama is sick. We'll pay you, I promise." The landlord barely glanced at me. "Promises don't pay rent, boy," he said, his tone cold. 2 weeks. His dismissal stung, but I clenched my fist and held back the urge to shout. Anger was no longer wild within me, it was a quiet, simmering storm. Back at school, my invisibility came to an abrupt end during another assembly. "Bantu." Mr. Nlovu called, his voice slicing through the crowd. Reluctantly, I stepped forward, my head low. "This is the kind of student we don't need," he said, holding up a piece of paper, my exam results, marked with failing grades. A waste of resources and space. The laughter erupted once again, but this time, it didn't feel like daggers, it felt like a bomb exploding inside me. I stared at the paper in his hand, the symbols of my failure glaring back at me. My fist tightened, my vision blurred, but I didn't say a word. I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. The laughter followed me all the way to the edge of the schoolyard, where I found Kofi leaning against the wall. "Barefoot Bantu strikes again," he said with a smirk. "You're not even trying anymore, are you?" I ignored him, but he stepped closer, blocking my path. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. "You're just a nobody pretending to matter." Something inside me snapped. You don't know anything about me, I said, my voice low but firm. Oh, I know enough, Kofi said, his smirk widening. You're just a waste, like your mother? No wonder your father left. The words hit me like a slap. Before I knew what I was doing, my fist connected with his jaw. Kofi stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the world stood still. Then I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the river. My chest heaved, my fist still trembling from the punch. The river had always been my refuge, but now it felt different. The water rippled gently under the afternoon sun, oblivious to the storm inside me. I picked up a stone and threw it as hard as I could. It skipped twice before sinking. You'll see, I whispered to the ripples. One day, they'll all see. When I returned home that evening, I found Mama lying on the floor again. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Mama. I shouted, dropping to my knees. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave me a weak smile. It's okay, Bantu, she whispered. Just tired. I knew she wasn't okay. I ran to the neighbor's house, begging them for help. Together, we carried her to the clinic. The doctor looked at her and shook his head. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and these medicines, he said, handing me another prescription I couldn't afford. I stared at the list, the words blurring through my tears. That night, as Mama slept fitfully, I sat outside our home, staring at the stars. The world felt cold, indifferent. My fist tightened as I thought about everything, Mr. Nlovu, Kofi, the landlord, the doctor, and the endless cycle of poverty that crushed us at every turn. I made another promise to myself. No more begging, I whispered to the night. No more waiting for them to care. The anger inside me solidified into something unbreakable. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about Mama, about every humiliation, every injustice. And in that moment, the path I would take became clear. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mama coughing. It wasn't the soft, occasional cough I was used to, it was deep, rattling, like her chest was caving in. I rushed to her side. Mama, we need to go to the clinic, I said, panic creeping into my voice. She shook her head weakly. We can't afford another visit, Bantu. I'll be fine. Her words felt like a knife to my chest. How many more times could she say that? How many more times could I watch her wither away? But I didn't argue. I didn't know what else to do. Later that day, I walked to the marketplace, clutching a small bag of vegetables Mama had asked me to sell. The market was bustling, full of life, laughter, and the smell of fresh produce. But for me, it felt distant, like I didn't belong in that world anymore. As I stood by a small corner, calling out half-heartedly to passers-by, a familiar voice broke through the noise. Bantu. I turned to see Momo's friend, Auntie Chipo, walking toward me. She was a heavy-set woman with a warm smile, dressed in a vibrant patterned dress. You look tired, my boy, she said, her voice full of concern. How is your mama? I hesitated, not wanting to burden her. But when I finally told her about Momo's health, her smile faded. Take this, she said, pressing a few crumpled bills into my hand. It's not much, but it will help. I stared at the money, my throat tightening. Thank you, I whispered, though the words felt too small for what she had given. But even as I walked home, clutching the money, the bitterness inside me grew. Why did we have to rely on scraps from others? Why was our survival always at the mercy of someone else's kindness? The next day at school, Kofi was in his usual spot, surrounded by his friends. They laughed and joked, their carefree voices grating against my ears. I sat in the back corner of the classroom, staring at my tattered notebook. I didn't bother taking notes anymore, it felt pointless. When the teacher called my name, I didn't respond. Bantu, she said again, her voice tinged with annoyance. I looked up, my expression blank. What? The class erupted into muffled laughter. The teacher frowned but moved on, ignoring me as usual. That was when I realized something. The world had already decided who I was, a failure, a nobody. If that's what they saw, then maybe it was time to embrace it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I walked to the river. The water was calm, reflecting the fiery orange and red of the sky. But inside me, there was no calm. I picked up a handful of stones and threw them one by one, watching the ripples spread across the surface. Each splash felt like a scream, a release of everything I was holding inside. "You'll see," I muttered, my voice low and steady. "One day, you'll all see." The anger wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a plan, a purpose. When I returned home, Mama was sitting by the kerosene lamp, her hands resting on her lap. She looked up as I walked in, her face softening with a tired smile. "Bantu," she said, motioning for me to sit beside her. I sat down, the weight of the day pressing heavily on me. "You're quiet these days," she said gently. "Tell me, what's in your heart?" I looked at her, my chest tightening. How could I tell her what I was feeling? The anger, the hopelessness, the dark thoughts that kept me awake at night. Instead, I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mama." She reached out, placing her hand on mine. "You're stronger than this, my boy. You rise above it all. I know you will." Her faith in me should have been comforting, but it felt like a burden, a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. The days blurred together after that. School, home, the river, it was all the same, an endless cycle of frustration and despair. But something inside me was shifting. The anger that had once been a quiet whisper was now a roar, demanding to be heard. I began withdrawing even more, avoiding everyone, including Mama. I didn't want her to see the person I was becoming. And in the silence, the plan began to take shape. The night was silent, save for the faint rustle of the wind through the cracks in our walls. Mama had fallen asleep early, her frail body unable to bear the weight of another long day. I sat in the corner of our dimly lit home, staring at the flickering kerosene lamp on the table. My hands rested on my knees, the scars from countless moments of clenched frustration faintly visible. The anger inside me no longer felt like a storm, it felt like steel, cold and sharp, ready to strike. I thought about everything, the laughter, the humiliation, the teasing, the looks of pity and disdain. I thought about Mr. Nlovu, Kofi, the landlord, the teachers, the neighbors who whispered behind closed doors. But most of all, I thought about Mama. About the sacrifices she had made, the pain she endured, and the faith she had in me, faith that I could never live up to. Something inside me solidified. A promise. A purpose. Before I went to bed that night, I walked over to Mama's side. She was breathing softly, her face peaceful for the first time in weeks. I knelt beside her, watching her for a moment, memorizing every line on her face, every sign of the battles she had fought. "I'll make them pay, Mama," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For you. For me. For everything they've taken from us." I didn't know if she heard me. Maybe it was better if she didn't. The next morning, I didn't go to school. Instead, I wandered to the river, the one place that had always given me a sense of calm. But even there, the water felt different, darker, colder, like it knew what I was planning. I stood at the edge, staring at my reflection in the rippling surface. "You're not that boy anymore," I said to myself. "The one who believed in dreams. He's gone." The reflection didn't answer, but I knew it agreed. I picked up a stone, clenching it tightly in my hand until the jagged edges cut into my palm. The pain was sharp, grounding, real. "I'm ready," I whispered. That night, as Mama slept, I packed a small bag with the few things I owned, a tattered notebook, a pencil, and the shoes Mama had worked so hard to buy for me. I didn't know exactly where I was going or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay. I paused at the door, glancing back at Mama one last time. "I'll make it right," I said softly. "I promise." And then, without another word, I stepped into the night. You think you know me now, don't you? You think you've seen it all, but you haven't. This is just the beginning. If you hated me already, you're going to hate me more. If you pitied me, you'll stop. Because the boy I was is gone. The man I became, he's something else entirely. You'll see. Next time, I'll show you how a monster is made.